So, Netflix's new live action Avatar The Last Airbender adaptation is out, and I've watched it, and I have thoughts that I figured I'd share as stream of consciousness as I can. I'm gonna try to upload this soonish because it came out yesterday and I just watched all of it. So, right off the bat, what are my thoughts? I think it's okay. I don't think it's the worst thing in existence. We've seen the original live action movie. That obviously was not that good. This is definitely better. It has its issues, and some of it is justified, and some of it is maybe a little unjustified. But on the whole, I don't think it was that bad. I feel like there's a sense that they were trying to do something different, and if I'm being honest, that's all I really wanted from this show. When it was originally announced, I know everybody was very, very, very cautious. I was a little bit more optimistic, not necessarily in that I think it was going to be like really good, but more than anything else, I wanted to see how the limitations of an 8-episode format would force them to be innovative with the story. Because as much as it's one of my favorite shows of all time, the original show has things that you could call flaws, things that maybe could have been improved upon a little bit. And I actually think that this new show did some things better. Not a whole lot, but there are some things that I think they improved upon. I'm going to try to separate my overall thoughts into just different like parts of the show, not like episodes or anything, just like different elements to look at it from, because otherwise I would just ramble on forever, and we're again trying to keep this short enough. But I will say that this will be a spoiler review. I'm not going to go explicit as when I can't. Like, I'm going to try to avoid being super, super over the top of spoilers, but I am going to discuss each episode and what happens in it. So, warning there are some changes from the original series. So even if you have seen the original, there are things that are different if you're trying to avoid any major spoilers for this show. Off the bat, though, we'll talk about technical stuff, music, visuals, CGI. What did I think of that? And to start off with music, I think it's really cool that they managed to take the original music from the show and bring this like heavy orchestral vibe to it. There is a little bit of something lost from the fact that we don't have those unique instrumentals from the original series. There isn't really the same like marimba and like very specific string instruments that they used for different pieces. It's much more like strings and pianos, and that's fine. I think it works in the context of the show. I think it works for the setting. I think some of them are very beautiful renditions of the original songs. Speaking of the settings, though, I love the set pieces for the show. I just adore all of the big, grand, epic set pieces that they incorporated into this series. The way that they made Omashu feel like real and tangible, the way that they expanded on the Southern Water Tribe, the way that they showed Kyoshi Island as this big sprawling like location that you can actually feel like you're visiting. I think that was a very clever thing that they incorporated into the series. And when there are practical sets, especially, it feels like real, and it feels something that you can actually visit, and that's cool. The actual effects in terms of how everything comes together they're hit or miss. I don't expect much out of Netflix. I really don't. And the reason for that is because compared to bigger studios, Netflix plain and simple does not have the same type of income to create projects like this. Like Disney has its merchandising, it has its different license agreements, it has its theme parks, it has so many different ways it makes money. Sony is technically a tech company, so they have tons of different revenue sources for that. And of course, even something like Warner Brothers owns a million different major IPs that they can collect different little checks from here and there. Netflix doesn't have many original IPs that they have long-standing credit for. Stranger Things is only like a few years old compared to something like Star Wars. And as a result, I don't really care when their effects are subpar. I know some people get very, very frustrated and they're like, oh, but the animation looks so much better. And yes, I won't disagree with you there. But I do appreciate the commitment to trying. They tried, and it feels less half-assed and more realistic in terms of what their limitations were. One thing I did really like was I loved the costumes. I loved all the textures on them. I loved the colors. I love the colors in general in this show. I think that it was much smarter to try to emulate that cartoonish vibe without making it look too goofy. They still kept to some grounded elements. They feel like real things that people would wear, and the little detail works in all of their costume. It's just like, it feels lived in, and it feels iconic in the way that the original show's simple but very standout designs felt. So on the whole, a decent score for effects. I think there are things like Appa and Momo that you could tell they worked around keeping them in the story to the same degree because they knew it was going to be very, very difficult to have like a little CGI lemur running around every single scene. And as a result, you can feel their presence missing. And every time they get brought back up, you're like, oh yeah, Appa and Momo, where have they been? But I get it. It's complicated. It's hard to incorporate big CGI creatures when you're already trying to do these huge like bending sequences, which on the whole were okay. There's a little bit too much slow motion for my liking, but they're fine. I don't think it was anything horribly offensive. There's no like "Hua, hua, 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 hua," and then like a rock goes flying across the screen like in the original movie. They don't have that same level of underwhelming choreography. It's just basic action movie choreography. Moving on from that, though, when we talk about the story, because I know some people are very curious about the story, given 8 episodes, each of them are a little less than an hour, they did a decent job. There are some parts where I think they were really, really clever in incorporating different episodes into one overarching storyline, and there's some parts where they felt a little like they were just sort of shoving everything in for the sake of shoving it in. The way that the show is broken up is that each 2 episode have like a bit of an arc to them, and they're sort of representative of the elements. They're not like strictly representative, but it's like the opening sequence, the title sequence shows the different like colors, the different symbols that represent each nation. So the first 2 episodes are supposed to be like our air episodes. The show specifically starts off with the beginning of the 100-Year War, as opposed to when Sokka and Katara find Aang. So we see Aang run away, we see the Fire Nation attack the monks, we learn about Gyatso, we learn about all this stuff. So that makes sense for an air episode. And then the second episode is specifically about the Kyoshi warriors. And the main difference in how they set up these beginning moments is that rather than the North being there like, oh, we need to teach Aang how to waterbend, so we need to get their end goal. Instead, they don't really have a set goal after episode 1, other than just we need to get away from Zuko and we can't go back to the village. And Aang actually steals like a journal Zuko keeps on the Avatar, which I think is a really cool idea and a good detail to throw in. And he learns about Kyoshi from that, and so they go to Kyoshi's island to see if they can get information from her, like if he can communicate with her. And from there, she tells him that the North is going to be under attack and that he needs to go there to protect them. And that's smart for a couple reasons. Number one, it gives us a reason to not wander around as much. I know that was something that a lot of people liked about the original first season, the idea that we're just sort of exploring and we're not necessarily held to a strict timetable. But for a show with this few episodes, it makes sense to cut the fat in a way that feels more like, oh, there's this very strict urgency to getting to the Northern Water Tribe. And even then, they still have moments where it's like Aang stops and goes out of his way to help people because he wants to help people, as opposed to just like, I don't know, I'm going to go ride some koi right now, because whatever. Not that that's bad. I don't want to imply that that's bad. I'm just saying that it's different. And I get why it's different. Because unlike the original series, they can't really use the comet as the motivating factor for like their urgency. Because, they're children that age and they're going to get older real soon. So if they do get 2 more seasons out of this, that could take like 4 years to make. And by that point, like Aang's actor, I think, might be a literal adult. So they don't mention the comet coming back at all until the very, very last second of the literally last scene is them being like, oh, the comet's coming back. And when Ozai asks, he specifically goes, soon. As opposed to like, oh, by the end of the year or within a couple years. They make it clear that's like, we don't want to say it's coming in a specific amount of time, because if Aang ages up fast, that's going to be hard to explain as, oh, it's been less than a year, So it makes sense. Then episodes 3 and 4 are Earth episodes, and they're focused on Omashu, and they combine a lot of elements from the first season. So you have Jet's there, he's in the city. You have the Mechanist and his son are there. That's actually what originally draws Aang to there, is he sees Teo gliding above the city. And I think it was really clever. If I had to pick like my favorite episodes in terms of how they adapted the story, I think these 2 would be like my favorite translations of these ideas, because the idea that the Mechanist would be working for Boomy is a really solid concept. I mean, they're both like kind of crazy inventor dudes. That makes sense. And the idea that Jet would be targeting the Mechanist and Boomy because he sees them as like not doing anything about the Fire Nation or actively working with them is also like, it makes sense. It fits their characters. And I think it adapts that storyline in a way that feels coherent and a way that feels like creative. Episodes 5 and 6 are where I get a little iffy. They're probably, I think 5 is my least favorite episode in the series. These are our Fire Nation episodes, and they combine the Spirit World arcs as well as a couple other ones from later in the series, some of which they kind of sloppily shoehorn in there for the sake of like, hey, remember this one? So it starts off with like the hey bye, okay, there's a forest being burned down, we need to go into the spirit world. But then Sokka and Katara are dragged in, and there they get captured by Ko. And Ko imprisons them, so Aang needs to go talk to Roku to learn what he can give back to Ko to get his friends back. And so this combines like a couple things. So originally in the spirit world, Aang goes to Roku because Roku's dragon finds him, and it's like, hey, we need to go learn about the comet. And this, he just decides to go to Roku directly. And sure, fine. He wants to save his friends. But then that leads into a different arc. So June actually captures him while he's on Roku's island after he leaves his confrontation with him, and then takes him to Zuko, who then has to give Aang over to Zhao. And that leads to the Blue Spirit arc, which originally the reason that Aang needed to get back to Sokka and Katara was because they were sick. In this, it's because he has this relic that he can give to Ko in order to get his friends back. And on paper, that's kind of an interesting way of combining like a lot of different storylines into one like continuous storyline. In execution, it's a little sloppy because there's not really the same sense of urgency that I feel like there should be. Because when Sokka and Katara are sick, it's like, okay, they're not like dead. They're not going to die. But we know that Aang is worried about them. But in this, there's a very real threat that Ko will kill them, essentially. And that's a little like, can we like hurry this up? But instead they adapt the escape with the Blue Spirit like 1-to-1, which makes it feel like kind of slower, and it just doesn't fit the pacing as well. And then they like skip over Roku like so much, like it just feels like he just sort of shows up and then Roku's like, hi Aang, what's up? And then that's it, which is weird because in the original series obviously that was like an important moment, was him first connecting with his very like previous last life. And they also specifically like say that you need to connect with Roku first before you can get to Kyoshi. So having him connected with Kyoshi first it's a decision. It's fine, I guess. But on the whole, there's also like weird stuff they introduce in these episodes. So like Wan Shi Tong is just sort of there, and I thought that was really stupid. If I had to pick my least favorite moment from the entire series, it would be when Wan Shi Tong just shows up and there's no reason for him to be there. He's just there to be like, hey, remember this episode from the next season? Which is dumb because it ruins any surprise to him later. It ruins like their interaction that could be new from them actually like seeing this weird big bird spirit in the mortal realm. But no, he's just there because reference, I guess. And they also bring in Azula, May, and Ty Lee, and I'll get to this in like the very end, last 2 episodes, but they didn't need to be here either. It was a distracting element to the series. They do show Ozai more in this, and I don't hate that. I'll get into the characterization later, but there are interesting things that they do with Ozai. It's just that I felt like Azula especially was like distracting. But moving on, 7 and 8 are our water episodes. That's where the Northern Water Tribe. And I think these episodes improve upon the original series the most. Like, I think 3 and 4 did the best job of like adapting things in a way that was different but made sense in the context of the format of the show. But 7 and 8 to me are the most direct adaptations that improved upon elements of the original show, because I have a bit of a problem with the original Northern Water Tribe depiction in the original show. Because when you want to introduce a culture where gender dynamics are a strict element of how they operate, it's a little frustrating to talk down to them with this like, oh, well, but that's sexist. Because speaking from my experience with like, growing up in a Hispanic primary community, gender roles are not seen as like a power dynamic so much as they're seen as responsibility. Women take care of the children, and that's not necessarily less than working. And for a lot of people, that's sort of how they view it, especially if they come from like poorer backgrounds, is the idea that working isn't something that you need to do in order to be valid. That being a mother or being a housekeeper or like some sort of caretaker is just as important, if not more important, than being like a field worker. It's just seen as like a natural, easy way to distinct that. And not to say that that means that it's right or that you should agree with that. It's just that there's valid perspectives that you can consider. And the original show didn't really offer that. But in this, they actually do. The healers are very specifically like, hey, Katara isn't healing like a good thing. Like, this is a noble cause that we're trying to do. And Katara has to apologize for being so dismissive of their practice and their culture. And I think that makes sense because it's clear that while she can be a fighter, she is still capable of respecting other people's choices to not fight. And on top of that, there's also the fact that it doesn't end with Paku just seeing a necklace and being like, oh, this was my ex's necklace, and then just accepting Katara as a fighter. That was so stupid. If I'm being like, can we agree that was dumb? That's not a good way to resolve that arc. It's just weird. It doesn't really fix anything. It doesn't really give you an explanation as to why Paku would change his mind about these things. It just feels like a shoehorned in, like, I don't know. They knew each other, I guess, and so he likes Katara now, which is stupid. And this, he never actually backs down until the fight begins. And Katara makes it clear that she's gonna fight with or without his permission. And then she also is able to rally some of the female waterbenders from the tribe, and they agree because they want to fight too, because they see it as important. So this is a good moment where it shows, like, yes, they're willing to make the decision with Katara's help. They're not mindlessly like slaves to this old archaic practice. These people in this culture have like perspectives, and they're not all a monolith, and they don't all follow Paku, and he's not the arbiter of their decisions. They're capable of having their own agency, and that's really well done. And then there's like a whole thing where Paku sends like a student to go listen to Katara, and on the whole, I just think Katara's arc as a waterbender is much more complete in this series, this version of the show, as opposed to the original. Because in the original, at times it was like, she's bad at it, she's bad at it, she's bad at it, and then she gets a little better, and now she's like a master. And I don't think that was nearly as clever as the way it was done here, where you see that she's not very good at it, and then she has very specific emotional lessons that she help her understand her bending better, both from Aang and Jet. And then she uses the world around her, like earthbenders, to adapt her technique, I guess, and learn new skills and create new ways of fighting. And then that comes back at the very end when she fights Paku, and everyone's like, oh, what was that one move you were doing? And it was something that we saw her create. It's cool because it ties into that theme of how we can't be isolationists, how we have to learn from each other, how we have to reach out and change if we want to survive, while at the same time giving Katara more of a very clear arc into a waterbending teacher that she will be able to instruct Aang from going forward, as opposed to them just sticking in the north and him learning from Paku. So I guess with that, we should like transition into like characterization and how they handle each different character. So the overarching theme of the show, and this is what I was saying earlier, is that isolationism is bad. You can't shoulder the burden alone. That Aang is being told over and over and over again by both like different avatars and Gyatso and different people that you can't rely on anybody. That trying to have people part of your life essentially puts them in danger. It makes you less focused. It makes you too focused on someone that could get hurt as opposed to the world, which is your responsibility. And this was something that was more stated in the last season of the original show, but not necessarily in the context of like his friends, but more in the context of his own desire not to kill. But then on top of that, there's also the whole like the Guru arc from the second season where he's like, you need to let go of Katara if you want to master the Avatar state. In this, it's much more explicitly about protecting the world and about how Aang can only do that if he's able to devote himself entirely to it. And the show actively says, hey, that's not a good thing. It understands that it's not like a one-to-one argument that you need to like rely on everyone else, but it still makes it clear that part of shouldering the burden means letting in other people so that they can help you shoulder it. And that if you do it by yourself, you're going to kind of destroy yourself. We see that a lot with like Iroh, who I think is really different in this show, and I don't know if I love it. If I had to pick like the one characterization that I'm not 100% a fan of, it would be Iroh's, because he's not nearly as like peaceful and calm as the original series. He's much more like aggressive, and maybe that was the actor, maybe it was a dialogue thing, but I do think it has a purpose. I think the point is that Iroh in this is very much a soldier recovering from war, and he doesn't exactly know how to be a good mentor yet. So he like has moments where he's trying to be funny, but it doesn't feel like he's naturally trying to be funny. It feels like he's intentionally trying to make Zuko laugh. And they do make one change to the story that I think explains that, and I think offers a unique characterization between him and Zuko, where after Lu Ten dies, Zuko is the only one to comfort Iroh. He walks up to him and he tells him the story about Lu Ten, and then he sits with him during the rest of the proceedings. And that to me is interesting because like Iroh learned from Zuko in that moment to have compassion. And from that point forward, he's trying to make sure that Zuko doesn't forget his compassion and that he holds on to it. And to see Iroh as someone who's learning to be a mentor through Zuko is an interesting new dynamic, because in the original, it's very much like, well, he was a war criminal and then his son died, so he got better. And they don't go into really how he got better or why he got better, other than he just had remorse and regret. And in this, showing that he has something to latch onto and like moments where he learns from the people that are younger than him is, to me, like a good idea. I don't know if it's necessarily like better than the original characterization, but it's an interesting concept. Zuko otherwise is mostly one-to-one with the show, except I don't think he's as cruel as the original show. He's not nearly as like underhanded with his tactics. In fact, they make it a very clear point that he views honor and the Fire Nation as a whole as people who are like committed to doing the right thing. Even in combat, they are very direct, they're very upfront. They're never going to like send in spies or like sneak around or like hire bounty hunters. He's very opposed to all that because to him that's dishonorable. And that new tactic means that like something like this Zuko would never steal Katara's necklace and use that as bait. Like he would never do something so dirty. I think it's interesting. I don't think it's necessarily better or worse than the original. I think it just is a new perspective, and it makes sense for his character, especially with Zuko's whole thing being about honor. In terms of Sokka and Katara, they're similar but more focused. I already went into Katara's arc and how she changes. I think she's pretty much the same character in terms of like writing. She doesn't nearly have as many like freak out jealous moments as in the original show, which I think was nice. Sokka he's still funny and he's still smart and he's still trying to be a warrior, but they reshape his story to more focus on the concept of identity and how he isn't sure who he is and who he wants to be outside of emulating his father, and the idea that maybe he's actually not that good at it. They specifically adapt the whole Iceberg Run storyline with Bato into having taken place in the Northern Water Tribe with his father, and that Sokka actually almost failed it. And it was only because of Bato that he passed, and that Hakoda actually questions whether or not Sokka is ready to lead as a result. And that moment I think is really strong. And I like that Hakoda is given like a characterization as opposed to just being the cool dad who just is like loves his kids but also is never around, you know. It's much more interesting to see that he might be a little bit disappointed in Sokka, and that Sokka is constantly trying to emulate his dad because he's worried that he won't be good enough for him. And so when they introduce the mechanist and Sokka is given the idea of like, oh, I could be an engineer and that could be how I present myself, I could be actually like a leader in a different way, and the warrior can mean something different for me. I think that's really smart. Especially once we get to the final moment where like Yue sacrifices herself and Sokka blames himself for it, and Yue's dad specifically says like, you were there to comfort her in her final moments. That's still like worth everything, you know. That's a warrior, is someone who's willing to put himself in that position, even if it's not literally fighting or literally saving people. It's still like important to show compassion and to show love for everyone else around you. So that was cool. I think they handled that very well. I know some people have said that Aang isn't as goofy in this show, and I don't agree. I think he's definitely very much a kid. I think he's just given more serious moments, and that's fine. It's a little repetitive, but I don't think it's bad. I think it works in the overall context of the show. The character they changed the most is definitely Zhao. He is no longer intimidating, unrestrained Jason Isaacs who's conniving and who has like secret knowledge and everything. He's a low-level petty officer who sees himself as better than everyone else. And some people are probably going to hate that. I don't think it's terrible, but this does lead to one of my bigger gripes with the show, which is that his intel, the person directing him, is Azula. I don't know how I feel about that, because on the one hand, that's not necessarily a bad twist if you want, like, why is this low-level officer, like, you know, able to accumulate so much power and seems to be, like, getting ahead so quickly if he doesn't seem like he knows very much what he's doing. And, like, oh, it's the Fire Lord's daughter has been speaking for him this whole time, and she's been using him as his, like, her, like, conduit to the outside world. That's fine. It's just that they show Azula, and they show her, like, interacting with him through these letters, so it's not a twist, it's not a reveal, it's just like a detail, and they don't even really explain much about how she's helping outside of her recognizing Zuko's broadswords in order to identify him as the Blue Spirit, which feels unnecessary. Like, of course it's Zuko, who else would it be? It's just, I don't know, there's a lot about it that just wasn't executed very well, and that makes Zhao feel underdeveloped, and that makes Azula's presence feel extremely unnecessary. Like, if they had the final moment of the show where, like, because they add on this detail that Omashu was taken during the attack on the Northern Water Tribe because Ozai didn't trust Zhao to finish the job properly, that was a good detail. And to have that moment at the end where it's revealed that Azula was leading the charge and that she's the one who's been, like, working with Zhao and that this was all, like, her idea, that's fine. I like that. And I actually really do like that Ozai is more present in the show, because in the original series, he is just kind of this faceless bad guy who we're just supposed to deal with killing at the end, except Aang has to show compassion to someone who is like pure evil. And in this, it's much more clear that he's evil, but because he really does believe in his ideology about strength and about compassion being a weakness. And he specifically uses Zuko to motivate Azula, which is interesting, because in the original, Azula is also just kind of like bad because she's bad, and it leads to a lot of discussion about like whether or not that's fair to say that she's like evil from like minute one and that her mom hates her because she's a monster. It's weird, and it's kind of awkward, and like it's a messy conversation, but I don't think it's one that really has a clear resolution in the context of the show. So for them to instead position it where Ozai burning Zuko is what made Azula realize that she can't be imperfect, that she needs to have perfection, otherwise this could happen to her, is honestly like it's a solid moment. I think it builds up her character better, and I think it allows for a more clear dynamic between the three of them, like Ozai, Zuko, and her, from the series going forward. It just, I don't know, you didn't need to show her that much. You could have kept her in the background. There's a lot of scenes of her just like fighting earthbenders, and it doesn't really like suggest much. Like, I don't need to see Ozai testing her. I don't think it was really well implemented, and I think it just kind of wasted time that could have been spent better developing episodes 5 and 6 more. So overall, I think it's fine. I think the biggest issues are things that are kind of subjective, which is primarily that the dialogue is a little long, it's a little rambly, there's maybe too many flashbacks, there's a little bit too much slow motion. If you don't like the effects, then they're going to be a little distracting. And if the performances are kind of iffy at times, especially for the kids, like I get it, they're children, but the younger, like Atara and Aang's actors struggle a bit from scene to scene, and maybe it's part of the direction. Maybe they're just not used to giving these kids direction. Maybe it's because they're trying to emulate the original characters too much. I don't know. If it bothers you, then it's going to bother you the whole way through. But if you're like me, and you've tempered your expectations, and you're trying to be as fair to the show as you can be, then I think you'll find interesting elements to it. There are parts that I think work better. There are parts that I think work equally as good as the original show, and there are parts that I think felt a little awkward. And the most awkward parts are the ones where they're desperately trying to reel us in as like Avatar fans by dropping in references to like the books and like the comics and different episodes that have been cut from the show. It's like, I don't need that. I need innovation, and I think that this show offers some of it. And even if it's not great, even if we're all willing to say like, I'm not willing to accept this as like a new part of the Avatar universe, at the very least you can take those new bits and pieces and use them to compare to the original story in any future adaptations, because I don't think it's bad to adapt a show like this. I know some people see it as like, well, why don't we just leave it alone? But I like different adaptations of stories because they offer new perspectives in different contexts. One of the main things about this show is that it questions the idea of sitting on the sidelines when you know that something needs to get done. And beyond that, the idea that if you step up, people are going to get hurt. And that's kind of an inevitability, but you need to accept that people are going to get hurt. Otherwise, you won't be able to make any substantial change. And that's something that I think is very important for now. Like, a lot of people talk about the original show and how it influences the more, like, I guess, progressive politics of today. But if we're looking at this series, I think it does ask about the next step, which is that good feelings aren't going to make change. That hope isn't just some kind thing that we all can just aspire to. That it's dangerous and that it's risky and that putting yourself out there and fighting means that people are going to get hurt. But you need to accept that, and because it means that we're going to make a difference. And that's good. That's some good information for now. I think a lot of people are a little caught up on that idea of like, oh, well, I don't want anyone to get hurt. It's like people are getting hurt. That's the reason we need to change things, is because people are getting hurt. There are systems that are clearly corrupt. Things are only going to get worse unless we make things better. So even if it makes things worse to begin with, if the end goal is to improve things, then we should all be for it. As long as we're willing to trust each other, as long as we're willing to be accepting of each other, as long as we're willing to have family and faith and community in each other and a brighter future, then it's worth it. And that's like a good message. I don't know. It could have been a lot worse. It could have been a lot more, I guess, cynical. It could have been a lot less respective of the original themes of the show. I think if something like Disney were to try to make this, they would have tried to sanitize it more. They would have maybe made the Fire Nation a little bit more overtly bad as opposed to showing more dimension and thought into them. But I don't know. That's just how I feel about it. So let me know what your thoughts are. I guess, too. That's fine. If you didn't like it, that's okay. There's obviously things to not like. I'm just one person telling you what I think as a fan of this franchise. So that's that. We're going to try to upload this fast. Not many cuts. So if it feels rambly, it's because it is rambly. But check out other videos, I guess. I was going to do a top, 2023 movies thing, and then I haven't finished editing it, and it's almost March. So maybe that'll come out. Maybe it won't. I don't know. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. And have a good time of day or something.